learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me.
Amen. You can be seated. I know it's been said a bunch today, but let me just also add to the chorus, Happy Mother's Day. You're not going to say it back? Oh. Has anybody done that? Has anybody had a you too today where you said you too? Oh, wait, no, you can't do that. We're going through a series on leadership this morning, or over these last few weeks, and this morning we're gonna pick that up. We're gonna be in 1 Timothy chapter 3, and we've been working through verse 1 through 7. And just by way of summary, if this is your first time with us, certainly welcome. We're glad that you are here. And what we've discovered is that in 1 and 2 Timothy, also in Titus, but especially as we mine down in these verses in chapter 3, that Paul is dealing with a leadership crisis. There's a leadership crisis within the church, and what Paul is doing here is he is writing to instruct a young pastor named Timothy on what it looks like to put people in positions of leadership. What are their character qualifications? What does it look like to appoint proper leadership within the church? And the main thing going on, Paul's primary concern is twofold. And number one, Paul wants to make sure that leaders are teaching right doctrine. He wants to make sure that the church is being instructed by teachers who are leading and shepherding the church with right doctrine, with truth, according to Scripture. But that's not his only concern. His other concern is that those teachers, those leaders within the church that are teaching, he wants to make sure that they're teaching right doctrine, but he also wants to make sure that their lifestyle and that their character match what they are teaching. And that if there's an issue in either one of those, if A, they're not teaching proper doctrine, if they're getting distracted and going off the cliff in terms of their teaching, then that can leave the church in a vulnerable place. But in the same way, if their character and their teaching don't align, that lack of character and that lack of discipleship within a leader can also lead the church astray. And the other thing that he is concerned about is that when that character doesn't match, it exposes the public witness of the church, that there is a danger that the public witness of the church is corrupted when leaders aren't teaching and leading along with their lifestyle. And so he wants them to model and take seriously the very things that they should be teaching and preaching clearly. And what we said before, and I want to repeat it, we'll repeat it every time that we are in this text, is that the elder is not an exception to the rule. Paul does not want to see elders that are established in positions of leadership, that are these super spiritual people that are just other than the congregation. The idea here is that an elder, that a leader within the church is someone who is moving in the same direction as everybody else, that they are representing an example of a mature following of Jesus, but it should be the very same things that everybody else within the church is seeking to establish and apply in their lives. And that example is really simple. In 1 Peter what we learn is that example is in humble submission to Jesus and a willful and joyful service of the church. And so that's the expectation for elders. And so in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1 through 7, you're going to get a deep dive into the characteristics that Paul expects to be present within the elder of the church. And so what I did is I kind of worked through this list, and I found that there are three main categories that I think are present within these character traits. And I shared those with you last week. The first is that the elders should be someone that demonstrates a submitted personality or submitted temperament. When I say submitted, I'm talking about submitted to the Spirit, that the leadership of the Spirit should be obvious in their temperament and personality. There's several items on the list that align with that. The second category is that they should also show submitted resources, that all that God has given and entrusted to them, they show generosity and submission in all that they have. And then finally, there is a need for observable fruit. So it should be obvious that the Spirit of God is at work in their life. Other people should be able to see it. Not just people within the congregation, but also people in the community. Their allegiance to Jesus ought to be obvious in observable fruit. And those are the three categories. And so we began working through that very first category last week of that submitted temperament and personality. I talked about one of those items in that grouping, which was drunkenness. But there's several other things that are associated with that submitted temperament and personality. And the two items that kind of form the heading of that grouping are that the elder is to be someone that is sober-minded and someone that is self-controlled. I think those two things form a heading of what that submitted temperament and personality ought to look like. They should be sober-minded and self-controlled. They should be a clear and a reasonable thinker. They should be someone that's able to keep their emotions in check. They should be someone that is not given to fleshly indulgences. And so last week, again, as I said, what Paul does is he gives in this list a few different items that would demonstrate a lack of sober-mindedness or a lack of self-control. There's 3 items on that list that would demonstrate a lack of sober-mindedness and self-control. And those things are drunkenness, violence, and quarrelsomeness. And he says that if an elder demonstrates a givenness to any of those things, that they're not to be an elder. Someone that demonstrates a drunkenness, violence, or quarrelsomeness should not be in a position of leadership within the church. And again, last week I dealt with the topic of drunkenness. If you're interested in that, you can go back and listen. But today, what I want to cover is the categories of violence and quarrelsomeness. Violence and quarrelsomeness cannot be present within an elder. Now notice that he says, and this is in verse 3, he says, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle. So as we look at violence, this is one of the items on the list that actually has an opposite expression attached to it. So he says that they're not to be violent, but he says that they are to be gentle. So there's a positive and negative expression that I want to get into. But first, what is he talking about when he's talking about violence? I think for most of us, when we think about violence, we think about the physical expression of violence. But the reality is that violence has physical and non-physical expressions. Violence can be defined just simply as intense, turbulent, or furious, and often destructive action or force. So right now we're under a thunderstorm warning, and often when we describe weather when it's bad weather, we can describe it as being violent. Weather has a force that comes with it. And when we're talking about violence as it relates to human beings, we are not just talking about that physical expression of violence. It can also be a non-physical expression of violence. We can express violence verbally and non-verbally, physically and non-physically. There are lots of different expressions of violence, but the point is that it's a powerful, destructive action or force. And when we're talking about this as it relates to a leader, there is a really important reason why this is on the list as a character disqualification for a leader. Because one of the things that can go seriously sideways, and I don't think we would have to chat long to come up with some examples, but one of the things that can go really sideways in a leader is when a leader begins to fall in love with the power and the control associated with that position of leadership. In fact, many times people are actually pursuing positions of leadership out of a desire for power and control. And when power and control get set up as an idol, and by the way, for a leader, this in itself is a absolute necessary discipline to make sure that you are in a position where you are not beginning to idolize a position because of the way that it can feed your ego. Because power and control can feed an ego unlike anything else. And oftentimes, leaders get used to that power and control. It feeds their ego, and now all of a sudden, that power and that control are necessary to a leader's feeling of well-being. Their self-security, their well-being is connected to whether or not they have power and control. This is a dangerous place. Power and control in that scenario have become idols. And when that happens, oftentimes what you will see is that when power and control and strength are idolized, then violence is deployed as a mechanism for the retention of strength and power and control that feeds our ego. When a leader is in a position of power and that power is idolized, then someone will, because of what it does for someone's self, their confidence, their sense of self, if I have to have that power and control, then when that power and control is perceived as slipping away from me, then violence is one of the quickest and most consistent responses in order to retain control. Because a loss of power and control is a loss of sense of self. So I have to hold on to control. I have to hold on to power at all costs. And violence is the expression of power, the expression of force in order to retain that power and control necessary for me to feel good about myself. And so you can see where this cycle can snowball really, 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 really quickly. And so Paul wants to make sure, he is adamant that when you are thinking about leadership within the church, that you are not putting people in positions of leadership who have a tendency towards violence, because that violence is an expression of a need for control, and it will bankrupt the church. It will harm and destroy the lives of those that this person is supposed to be shepherding. A shepherd cannot be given to violence and control. But he says that there is an opposite. And I want to push us here a little bit, because I said to you at the beginning of this series that I think there are some very dangerous ways in which the things that are the world around us values in a leader that are not kingdom characteristics of a leader have crept into the church. And I think this one here hits especially close to home, because Paul says that they're not to be violent, but then he gives an opposite positive expression. And he says that they're to be what? What does the text say? Gentle. Gentle. He sets gentleness up as the opposite expression of violence. And because I think it's the first reaction in the room, what I want to say is that gentleness is not a weakness. It is not a passivity. Gentleness is not a characteristic describing someone that just lets anybody do whatever it is that they want to do. Because the first thing I want to ask is, do we see that in Jesus? Does Jesus lack the backbone to take a stand when a stand needs to be taken? No, absolutely not. Does Jesus display a firmness and a strength when those characteristics are necessary? Absolutely, he does. He rebukes the Pharisees frequently. Jesus stands up and holds a firm line when it comes to the judgment of the Pharisees. Jesus overturns tables at the temple. He draws a hard line when it comes to the abuse of God's house, which should be a house of prayer. So gentleness is not a way of saying the leader should just be someone that lets people do whatever they want. It is not talking about a passivity. Gentleness, I believe, is the ability to understand the force and the strength necessary for the situation, and the discipline to differentiate between a firm resoluteness and an over-application of power. You with me? There's a difference between being firm and resolved and the over-application of power, force, and strength for the purpose of control. And gentleness is the discipline to not exert power and strength when those things are unnecessary. Someone can be gentle but firm when the situation requires firmness. But I'm just telling you, there is a profound maturity to not over applying strength and force for the sake of control. And I want to just ask you, just as a measurement of how deeply embedded I think a broken model of leadership is in our mind, how many of us, especially just can I ask men in the room, how many of us hold gentleness as a high value? How many of us would raise their hand and I'm not asking you to do that, I'm not calling you out here, but I'm just like, man, just seriously, how many of us would really say, you know what I want to be? When I grow up, I want to be a gentleman. You laugh, but we don't. We don't often talk about that as a character trait to be pursued. And more than that, how many of us are actually praying that? How many of us are seeking the Spirit of God so that we might become more and more and more gentle? How many of us are going, God, would you please, by the power of your Spirit, would you make me more and more gentle? And I would just say that in any culture where power and control are idols, violence will be an expression within that culture. And I think this is an area where, as a church, we need to really, really examine ourselves. I'm curious if we would believe that there is a link between the violent expressions of abuse that we often find in church leadership scandals, if there is a link between that expression in leadership and the idolatry of power that has crept into our churches. Y'all with me this morning? Y'all thought because it was Mother's Day we weren't going to go hard? Moms can take it. Buckle up, everybody else. Do you think those things are linked? Do you think that the subtle idolatry of power, strength, and control has anything to do with the manifestations of broken leadership that we see often expressing themselves in violence within the church? Listen, I think those things are connected. I remember being bothered by this and really, I think, thinking about this deeply for the first time. As many of you know, I try to shout out West Texas as often as possible. And I went to Texas Tech, and while I was there, I was involved in the women's basketball program. And so I kind of had this really cool behind-the-scenes look at just a sport that I've loved since I was a kid. But during that time, Tech made a coaching hire. It was a bit of a controversial coaching hire, and this person that they hired had a reputation for outbursts of anger and outbursts of violence and being a pretty rough around the edges kind of guy. And I remember going, man, this is going to be interesting. I'm going to kind of see behind the scenes of what this is going to look like. And I'm just telling you that being behind the scenes, I saw things and learned ways that you could string profane words together in ways that I had never heard before. I saw outbursts of anger that I'd never seen before, that I'd never been around before, and it was really eye-opening. But you know what I often heard when that would come up in terms of the conversation around this person's character? You know what I would often hear? I would often hear references to their coaching record. I would often hear references to the greatness of their basketball prowess, to their ability to understand and know how to scheme the game, how to recruit players that could play within the system. And we I think, idolized the record, the wins and losses, and as a way of medicating what we were ignoring, which was the deeper-seated character issues. And that was the first time I'd really gone, okay, wait a minute, man, that seems to be a problem. There seems to be something broken in there that we're justifying all sorts of anger and violence based on the record of wins and losses. And I think on some level I might go, yeah, but that's the world. That's the world. And of course, at the end of the day, what matters in the world? Sure, what matters is wins and losses. What matters is hierarchy on the ladder. What matters is how much you make and what you got. Like, of course, out there, those things matter. And I think in some way I get it. But in here, have we taken that poison pill of idolatry, of power and strength and control? Could it be that maybe within the walls of our churches, we have also succumbed to that higher value of output than character? And here's the deal. I think oftentimes what we ask about a leader is not, are they gentle and do they demonstrate Christ-likeness within the church? I think oftentimes we go, well, how many people are coming on a Sunday? How many people are coming? What's the budget? How many people did you baptize last year? How many people are in Sunday school? Man, I think it's Baptist too, and I'm not trying to step on any toes. Like, we've been guilty of that for sure. Like, if you think back to old Baptist days, like, we got the numbers posted at the front of the worship center. Like, how you like them apples? You see those Sunday school numbers? Come on, right? Just a joke, just trying to, you know what I'm saying? I think sometimes we value that output. We're not asking questions about churches' leadership that are related to the demonstration of Christ-like character. And I think if we don't value in here, if we don't value a demonstration of Christ-likeness within our leaders, what makes us think that the rest of us are going to value the demonstration of Christ-likeness? And then what makes us think that we will not be open and vulnerable to the broken expressions of that value system? Why are we surprised when expressions of violence show up in church leadership when we have all idolized power and control? Y'all with me? He also says that the elder should not be quarrelsome. They should not be quarrelsome. What does it mean to be quarrelsome? The thing that came to my mind, this isn't Webster's, this is Kindle, is just looking for a fight. That's what I think of when I think of quarrelsome. This is just somebody that's looking for a fight. This is somebody that is pursuing unnecessary conflict. You guys remember that sermon on conflict? Everybody raise your hand, make me feel better. Okay, good. Good. Anytime a preacher says, do you remember that sermon? You just nod. Okay? You're like, yes, Pastor, it was moving, right? No kidding. I had a guy one time, I was a college pastor, I had a guy one time, fell asleep. I get it, college students fall asleep all the time. Fell asleep, front row. Where John's sitting right here, this dude fell asleep this far from me. Totally passed out asleep. The kind of asleep where you twitch. Y'all know what I'm talking about? And then that kind of asleep. And I'm like right here, like I don't see you. And then afterwards, he came up to me, and after the Sunday school lesson, he came up to me, he was like, man, that was the most moving sermon. And then I turned around and I said, Holy Spirit, thank you that you move. Despite my words, because the only way he heard from you this morning, God, is if you gave him a dream. So quarrelsome is looking for a fight. It's unnecessary conflict. So a few weeks ago, I talked to you about conflict. And I talked to you about how actually conflict is good. Conflict is a gift within relationships. Because conflict, handled properly, actually gives depth to a relationship. But we looked at this survey, this study I thought was fascinating. But one of the things that it showed was that at some point, that repetition of conflict is always going to degrade relationships. So the point is not whether or not conflict is okay or not, but the point is what it was showing was at some point, man, if you're just seeking out conflict, if there is conflict over and over and over and over and over and over again in a relationship, then just the sheer repetition of conflict is going to degrade the relationship. And so quarrelsomeness is that person that is unnecessarily seeking out conflict. Why is that important that not be a character trait within a leader? Well, number one, because just the seeking out of conflict can get you all sorts of distracted. How many times have we seen that in church history where just unnecessary conflict gets us totally distracted from what it is that God wants from us? We're arguing about paint colors and seats and music and dress and all sorts of stuff, unnecessary conflict. And what does it ultimately do? It contributes to us being completely distracted from the mission of God, completely distracted from discipleship. So if a leader is leading in conflict, you're going to have a church that's completely distracted in what God has asked of her within the community. But the other thing is that if someone that is seeking out unnecessary conflict is probably someone that is masking deeper down issues. There is likely deep levels of insecurity within someone who is seeking out repeated conflict. Because Jesus, I think, makes this really, really clear. This is the speck in your brother's eye and the log in your own. That oftentimes when there's a log in our own, instead of dealing with the log that's in our own eye, we like to deflect and create conflict with somebody else because we don't want to deal with the log that is in our own eye. And so it's much more convenient to come to you and say, Madison, thank you very much. Do you see that speck in your eye? When the reality is that I've just created conflict because I would much rather not look in the mirror. I'm disguising, I'm hiding from the very things in my own life that God wants to do. And so someone who is quarrelsome is not fit for leadership because they will lead the church in distraction, and they themselves are manifesting in that quarrelsomeness a deep insecurity. So let's talk about the process of sorting these things out, because here's what I don't want to do. I don't want to paint this picture that somehow the leader is just supposed to have it all together, that they never wrestle with these things, that they're never dealing with insecurity, they're never dealing with the things that are listed on this list, because that's not necessarily the case. That's not the case at all. Paul wants the church to be wise and to discern, but it's not to say that the elder, the leader, is supposed to be somehow this perfect individual. So what is it that brings us to a place where our life looks like the kind of character that Paul is describing here? How do we become people that are gentle and not violent? Because here's what I'm going to say to you, that I think it's not just important that the leader is someone that you can look at and say, they're gentle, not violent. But the leader should also be modeling a process of discipleship that shows and leads the congregation in what it looks like to humble myself before God in such a way that I'm becoming a gentle person. The leader should not just be on a pedestal, should not at all be on a pedestal as like, look at this character trait. But the leader should do is the leader should be someone that you can look into their life and see habits and disciplines and routines that are obvious and observable and that you're invited into that produce the kind of character that a leader should have. Do you hear me? And so what does it look like, if this is something that we're all supposed to be moving towards, what does it look like to become someone who is gentle, to become someone that's not violent, to become someone that's not given to quarrelsomeness? And I wanted to show you this image, and this maybe has been done before. I don't know if this is necessarily original to me, but I'm calling this the iceberg of formation. I think we have the iceberg ready. Give me a thumbs up if we have an ice. Yes, there it is. Do you see it? The iceberg of formation. That's pretty good, right? The things on the top. The things on the top are the things that we typically see. Notice up there you've got behavior and belief. When I talk about behavior, I'm talking about our actions. This is the stuff that's observable. When I talk about belief, I'm talking about is your knowledge of the right answers present? Because oftentimes that's what we're measuring. When we come in church, Christian settings, we're asking those two questions. Do you know the right answer, and do you behave the right way? Right? Isn't that often? That's kind of what we're looking for. And here's the deal. Look at me. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. Do we need to believe the right things? Yes. Should our doctrine be correct? Yes. I'm certainly not de-emphasizing that. And are there absolutely standards and boundaries that God has given for us as it relates to Christian behavior? Absolutely. Yes, yes, and more. Yes, absolutely, that's the case. Those, though, are the things that we see. Our issue is that those are typically the only things that we pay attention to. Typically, the only things that we pay attention to are those things that are visible, that top of the iceberg. Those are the things that we typically spend most of our lives working on. And the things on the top of that iceberg are primarily done through increased knowledge through experiences. So the way normally that people grow in terms of behavior and belief is through knowledge. If I'm going to behave the right way, I need to know, what are we asking? What are we always asking? What are the rules? I want to know the rules. And again, that's not a bad question. It's just not the only question. But if I know the rules, I can align to, for the most part, those rules. If I have the answers, if I will increase in knowledge, then I will have right belief. And most of the time, as it relates to our formation, those are the two things that we're working on. Just those things in the top. And so here's what we do. We do just enough Sunday morning to keep us from falling off the cliff. That's what and we call it spiritual formation. And what we mean by that is we show up to church once or twice a month, and we might go to Sunday school. But here's the deal. if your only goal is to behave the right way, if your only goal is to know the right answers, then actually that's not a bad plan. If all you want to do is avoid the major errors in terms of behavior and belief, then it sort of makes sense that all we do is go to church once or twice a month. The problem with that is that we're never actually getting below the surface into the parts of our life that the Spirit of God is actually wanting to work on. The problem with that model of just dealing with above the iceberg is that we stay very shallow and very immature. And most of the time, suffering in our life, which by the way is coming, or you're in the middle of it, exposes that shallowness. Because we've never really gone deeper. We've never really allowed the Spirit of God to go into the heart level of things. We've simply wanted to know what are the right answers and what is the right belief. And so we stay very, 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 very immature. Now, I'm not being critical of you. I think that immediately leaders in churches need to ask a profound question, which is, why is that the case? Why are our people not going deeper? I think there are some serious ways in which we need to put our model of church under the microscope, and we need to be asking ourselves, how deep a discipleship are we even inviting people into? Or are we reinforcing this model of only deal with the tip of the iceberg? I heard a guy say this last week. I thought it was wonderful. He said, if people are supposed to be seeking first the kingdom, then as pastors and church leaders, are we even telling people what the kingdom is? Does our model of discipleship even invite you into a place where those deeper things could be dealt with? Or are we just happy with numbers and attendance and a very shallow form of Christianity because it makes us look good out in the community if this church is bigger than all the other ones down the street? But here's the deal. There's another layer on that iceberg. Do you see it? The deeper layer. And I just threw a few things up here, and there may be some others that could go on this, or you may say something different, but it's the level of our personality. It's the level of our family history, of the things that our experiences, what we've been through, and how those experiences have shaped us. It's the level of dealing with different trauma that maybe we have been through, and the way that trauma shapes and forms our life, and the way that the enemy loves to attach lies of identity to experiences and sin and trauma. It's the layer of our ego, where we're differentiating. Hey, am I pursuing this because it makes me feel better, or am I laying myself down really to follow Jesus? And I'm just telling you, these are the sorts of things that lie below the surface. But this is the stuff that really makes us tick. This is the stuff that actually, on the deeper level, is producing the things that you see at the tip of that iceberg. But here's the thing. If we're going to be formed on that deeper layer, that interior of our lives, then once or twice a month at a church service just ain't going to do it. We've got to go beyond just the growth in knowledge and the experience of an event, of a service, if we really want to tap down into those deeper things. And here's the things that form us on that deeper layer. And again, there may be more on this list or less. I've tried to make something very simple here. But one of the things that forms us on this deep level is deep, deep community and friendship. Deep relationships form us on this more interior, this bottom part of the iceberg. When you are truly known in a setting where you have deep friendship and community, where you're confessing sin, where you're giving deeply of yourselves, genuine self-sacrifice for others, where others are genuinely sacrificing themselves for you to build one another up and shape one another, that's where some of that deep level formation goes. One of the things that's been common over the last several years as we look at just notable church leadership scandals is that there's a part of this leader's life that's hidden. As a leader myself, seeing that consistency is absolutely terrifying. And one of the things I'm trying to do in my own life is just go, I don't want to hide anything. I don't want any part of my life to be unavailable for somebody else to look into. Because if there is some part of my life that no person in my life that's full of the Spirit can look into, then I've got a serious problem. You with me? But here's the deal, that's not just for leaders. Every single one of us should be cultivating relationships where our lives are exposed before others, because it keeps things from being hidden. It keeps sin from being hidden and growing in that dark and secret place to where at some point it will manifest itself above the water. Deep community and friendship, and I'm harping on this because I'm just watching our culture move further and further and further and further away from this kind of pursuit. But it's necessary. We are moving right now away from the table from one another at a rapid rate. And church, I'm looking at you and saying, fight to stay at the table. Fight for the dinner table with your family. Fight for the coffee table with your friends. Fight for spaces where you can have genuine conversation and be known. Fight for authenticity in your marriage. Fight for friendships where people aren't just going to tell you what you want to hear, but what you need to hear. It is a worthwhile fight and will keep you from a myriad of issues if someone just knows you. It is in that knowledge, that deep friendship where we're loving one another and praying for one another and building one another up, that the Spirit of God gets access into some of the deepest parts of us. Every Tuesday morning at 6:30, I sit down with a group of men that can know anything about my life. Anything's on the table. Do you have those spaces where someone can ask you anything? The next thing I think forms us to that deeper level, and this is going to be fun, you're going to love this one, is suffering and pain. Here's the hard thing about suffering and pain. We don't call the shots. It just shows up. We're completely out of control. But here's the deal. I think another thing I see in our culture, I'm afraid about in our churches, is that we're avoiding suffering and pain. As if somehow that means that God doesn't love us, or that God isn't good enough, or that we don't have enough faith, or whatever. We're just pursuing the happy life, and by happy we don't mean deeply content. We just mean a life free of any sort of tension, and so we're avoiding all things that would make us hurt and suffer. But here's the deal: suffering and pain create deep, deep, deep levels of intimacy with God, because what we discover in suffering and pain is that He is present even in those places, that He has shouldered even that pain that you thought nobody else understands. What you will find is that the Messiah is there on the tree, enduring that pain with you. And we miss that profound depth with God when we avoid suffering and pain. But He forms us in the deeper places when we walk through those moments. And then I'm getting long, and you've got Mother's Day things, but here's the deal. Here's the other thing that I think forms us is deep prayer, silence, solitude, fasting, these spiritual disciplines that have been tested and walked through by Christians for 2,000 years. And for some reason, we're like, no, we got this. I don't need solitude. I don't need fasting. I don't need Sabbath. I don't need these things anymore. For some reason, we've thought that we've got this figured out. And I'm just telling you, we don't have this figured out. That those are disciplines not to be pursued in and of themselves. There's no bonus points in heaven if you fast once a week. None. But what Christians have discovered, what Jesus Himself practiced, is that there are certain disciplines, certain ways of saying no to the normal things of our routine that allow for us to have relationship with God on the deep interior places of our life. Solitude, silence, for example. How noisy is our world? How often are you being inundated with a message, any message, noise? Often. Silence and solitude is just a discipline that says, I'm going to say no to that because the voice I want to hear is the voice of my Father. These are the things that form us deep on the inside. And so here's the deal. The point is, Paul doesn't just say, hey, find leaders who haven't gotten in trouble with the law for violence. Can you imagine if he was just like, just make sure they haven't been arrested and that it didn't have anything to do with violence or quarrelsomeness, right? Just do a background check. And then they're qualified as an elder. No, Paul says, well, I don't want them to be, they can't be violent, but they also must be gentle. And the point is that not acting violently and being gentle are two different things, aren't they? Come on. Not acting violently and being gentle are two different things. One speaks of just restraint. The other speaks of a transformed personality where violence isn't necessary. Becoming gentle is about becoming like Jesus in a way that I don't need violence to retain power and control. Man, that's profound. Paul says that he's learned that. We read it this morning. Whitney read it for us this morning. I've learned that. It takes learning, it takes formation, and it takes those things that I just mentioned. And here's what I would just say. If the elder is going to be displaying these characteristics in their own life, they must themselves be taking these formational tools seriously. But we all should be taking these formational tools seriously. The elder should simply just be one somebody that is an example to the congregation, that's life is open to the congregation and say, hey, here's how Jesus is forming me. Here, you want to participate with me? My life is open for you to come and join me in being shaped and formed by Jesus. Here's what it looks like in my life. So I want to come to a time of invitation this morning. I want to invite you to stand. And here's what I want to do. I want to just invite all of us just to collectively ask God to go below the surface. I know you're standing up and you're in transition and you're immediately thinking about whatever it is that you've made mom to eat, but just hang on for one more second. What would it look like for you this morning to invite the Spirit of God to work below the surface? The first step, I think, is to acknowledge that God wants to go there, and in fact, is already there. But I believe that God works in tandem with our will as it relates to our transformation. God will not go into areas in your life and transform you that you will not allow for God to work on. You can quench the Spirit by saying, actually, God, no, that part of my life is not open to you. And it's not that God is not there, but God will wait on us to cooperate with our will for our transformation. Because we are not robots. We are humans, made in God's image to reflect His personality, His nature, His character. And we do that through being in relationship with Him. And how many of you know relationship takes two people? So the Spirit of God, the person of God that lives and dwells on the inside of us, that wants to make us more and more and more like the character of Jesus, to produce the fruit of the Spirit in our life, will do so through relationship. You have to participate. How many of us are ready this morning to just say, God, would you go below the surface? Where are you already working below the surface that I can join you, that maybe I've been saying no to you? I think we need to make this a matter of prayer to become more and more open to the Spirit's work below the surface. If you're in a place where Sunday morning, what you're doing here is really disconnected from Monday through Saturday, and this is like the only space where you're being formed, I want you to just ask yourself, which of those tools that I listed for deeper transformation are you maybe neglecting or ignoring? Maybe you've been neglecting deeper relationship. Maybe you're in a place of pain or suffering that you haven't seen as a sacred place where God could work. You've just been trying to get out of it, but God's going, I want to just speak to you in the midst of it. I would just encourage you to just think about, maybe God's already working in that deep place, and He's just inviting you to join. I want to pray for you and want to remind you that in the back, we've got prayer partners. If you just need to come lay your head down on these steps, just as an act of obedience, you're certainly welcome to do that. Would also stress to you that the church is the church because we minister to one another. And so if this is a time where you need to move across the room and pray for somebody, have a conversation with somebody, whatever it might be, then you are free to do that. I would just encourage you to be obedient to God's Spirit as you do. Holy Spirit, we just ask that you would lead us and guide us. we do ask just collectively, and I know I can just say this certainly as I pray this in my own life. God, I don't want to be afraid of you going to the deep places in my life. I want to be transformed. And I realize that as I pray that can be very, very, very scary. That opens me up to have to maybe deal with some things that I'd rather not talk about, I'd rather not deal with. But God, here's the deal. We know that you are kind and good. We know that you are love. And so we know that